What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Just One Man, the Revelation series. Full disclosure, I am a little bit under the weather today, so may have to pause to get a drink or cough or do whatever. So if you're listening and like all of a sudden I sound really different, that's the reason behind that. So we'll go ahead and jump in. We're going to be looking at chapter 14 today. And over previous episodes, we've covered a lot of information. So, as we're coming to this end of our mid tribulation period, I just wanted to take a moment to kind of stitch together everything that we have learned about this mid moment period. Now, the trigger for all the mid tribulation events seem to have been Satan's casting down from heaven. After he loses the war with Michael, he's bound to earth and knows that his time is short, so he begins a war with the saints and the Jewish people. He first attacks the believing Jews, and the Lord protects them in this fortress in the desert. Then he departs and he seeks a new strategy, beginning with orchestrating the death and resurrection of the Antichrist. The man is killed in Jerusalem by the three kings and then is resurrected by Satan. His resurrection stuns the world. They celebrate him as a savior. His first act is to kill the three kings and the two witnesses in Jerusalem and then enter the temple. In the temple, the Antichrist declares himself to be God and puts an end to the practice of Judaism. He eventually leaves the city to complete his conquest of the world and to persecute the saints. Before he goes, Satan raises up a second man to be a false prophet who, in the Antichrist's presence, possesses great power. False prophet tells the world to worship the Antichrist. He sets up an image of the Antichrist in the temple to focus worship after the Antichrist leaves Jerusalem. And he institutes a new religious order for the world that requires taking a mark to buy or sell. Those who refuse the mark are executed. All these things happen in a relatively brief period of time at the midpoint of tribulation. We have one more chapter of the mid tribulation events and then a concluding chapter to close out this portion of the book. So let's set the scene for chapter 14. The false prophet has now is now requiring all humanity to worship the Antichrist and to take the mark. If they don't worship the image, then they're killed. And if they do take the mark of the beast on their body, then if they do not, then they can't buy or sell anything. False prophet's requirement, he's placed all of mankind between this rock and a hard place, if you will, because on one hand, you refuse the mark and you die. On the other hand, you take the mark and forever be excluded from the possibility of receiving salvation. Everyone must now make a public declaration for whether you're for or against. There's no room for undecideds or agnostics. The world's going to be polarized into a few camps defined according to their response. Among those who choose not to worship, the principal group will be believers, both Jew and Gentile. The believing remnant, who lies in protection, they will be the only ones who escape persecution once they reach Bozrah. Then there will be believing Gentiles, who will experience severe persecution, and many, if not most, will be martyred. Finally, there will also be unbelievers who refuse the mark, namely the Orthodox Jews who continue to believe in Yahweh. Both these groups will face stiff persecution. Many will die, though as we will see, some will survive. But there's one more distinct group that will never take the mark of the beast, and so too they are persecuted. But unlike the earlier groups, none of those in this fourth group will survive the tribulation. In fact, 100% of them will be martyred, and that is the 144,000 Jewish evangelists that began the work of salvation during this period of history. That's the group that we open with tonight in our study, starting with Revelation chapter 14, verse 1. Then I looked, and behold, the Lamb was standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his name and the name of his Father written on their foreheads. So John's vision transitions to a new scene, that of the Lamb standing on Mount Zion. And we know from earlier chapters that the Lamb is Christ, but then we're told he's standing on Mount Zion. Now, today there is a mountain directly south of the temple mount in Jerusalem called Mount Zion. So at first glance, we might assume that John was witnessing Jesus standing on the earth in Jerusalem. But there's several problems with that view, beginning with what we see in the rest of Revelation. The previous time we saw the Lamb mentioned as part of the action was back in chapter 8 when he broke the seventh seal. At that time, Jesus was in the throne room in heaven, and the next time we see the Lamb taking part of the action will be in chapter 19 when he returns to earth. So logically, we should expect the Lamb to remain in the heavenly realm until the return in chapter 19. But at this point, we're only at the midpoint of tribulation. So that raises questions of where this scene is taking place, which we'll answer as we move ahead. Next, we see the 144,000 standing with Jesus, having the name of the Father written on their foreheads. Obviously, this group of 144,000 Jewish men is a reference back to the events of chapter 7 when the Jewish men were commissioned. Those 144,000 were marked with the seal of the living God, which is the name of the Father. Then they went out to bring an uncountable multitude to faith. Since then, we haven't heard anything of these men and their work, but now as we reach this midpoint, we find them standing with Jesus on Mount Zion. Are they on the Mount Zion of present-day Jerusalem? If so, then that would mean that Jesus was standing with them on earth in the middle of tribulation, but that can't be, since we know that Jesus doesn't return until the end of the age, according to Daniel. So where's this scene taking place? Well, to answer that, we need to move a little further in our text. So we'll go back and pick up in verse 2. And I heard a voice from heaven, like the sound of many waters, like the sound of loud thunder, and the voice which I heard was like the sound of the harpists playing their harps. And they sang a new song before the throne, and before the four living creatures and the elders, and no one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been purchased from the earth. These are the ones who have not been defiled with woman, for they have kept themselves chaste. These are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These have been purchased from among men as first fruits to God and to the Lamb, and no lie was found in their mouth. They are blameless. As John sees Jesus in the 144,000, he hears a voice from heaven, but the voice isn't really a voice, it's a loud thundering sound. It's also like the sound of harpists playing, so it's the sound of many thundering voices combined with harps playing. That's a very unique sound and difficult to imagine, and it came from the throne, so it seems to be the voice of God. Then John says the 144,000 began singing before the throne and before the creatures and the elders. The only ones who knew the song were the 144,000. So we got to conclude that the only ones singing are them. And if they are the ones singing before the throne, then they're obviously in heaven, as is Jesus. So why did John say he saw them on Mount Zion? Mount Zion is a common term in the Bible for the kingdom of Israel in glory. So John saw the future kingdom of Israel in glory depicted in the heavenly throne room. Jesus in his glory preparing to rule, and 144,000 Jewish men prepared to enter and rule with Jesus. And they're standing on the heavenly Mount Zion in the New Jerusalem in heaven. The New Testament mentions Mount Zion in heaven, at least in a couple of places. Hebrews 12:22 says, "But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to myriads of angels." The writer of Hebrews says that our future lies in heaven with a heavenly Mount Zion ready to descend to earth. And Paul says that Jesus will come from this place when he returns to earth in Romans 11:26. And so all Israel will be saved, just as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will remove ungodliness from Jacob. So the chapter opened with a scene of Jesus in heaven, accompanied by the 144,000 evangelists. So why is John being shown this scene in heaven with Jesus at this moment? Well, if you notice back in verse 3, the 144,000 are described as those who were purchased from the earth. To be from the earth is a clear indication that they've left earth and they've arrived in heaven. And they were purchased, which means redeemed by the blood of Christ. Back in chapter 5, we heard something very similar. We had another group around the throne singing a song declaring that Jesus purchased men from the earth. In this context, the term purchase clearly refers to the Lord purchasing believers by his sacrifice on the cross. So here in chapter 14, we have to conclude that these 144,000 were removed from the earth and now reside in heaven, and they entered heaven because they believed in Jesus. Then in verse 4, we're given the reason for their deaths. They were the first fruits for God. The concept of first fruits is found all throughout Scripture, and the concept is simple. During any reaping of produce, the best fruit are typically harvested first, low-hanging fruit. In the law, the Lord dictated that these would be given to God as an offering of thanks. And the Lord deserves the first and the best of everything, including in the bounty of the land. So the concept of first fruits is that the best goes first and belongs to the Lord. And in verse 4, we're told that these men are the ones who follow Jesus everywhere. They're in heaven, so clearly they've died. And since it's mid-tribulation, they died before the second half, so they are the first and best of the martyrs that will soon follow. They aren't necessarily the first people to die during tribulation, but they are the first group to enter complete into heaven. They were a privileged group because they were the first to receive faith after the rapture removed all believers from earth, and they were the first to spread the gospel again. They were also set apart from earthly pleasures like marriage so that they could be dedicated to serving Jesus, and they were single-minded to their tasks, obediently following Jesus wherever he asked them to go and whatever he wanted done. Verse 5, we're told that they never lie, which is, that's a truly powerful testimony for any person. They certainly weren't sinless, but it appears they were on a level of Paul or the other apostles in their sanctified lifestyle. Simply put, they were models of obedience and service during their short time on earth. Then, as further grace to them, the Lord allows them to be the first of the martyrs, removed from earth before the worst of tribulation starts, and they were probably being killed throughout the first half of tribulation, and then when the mark is required and worship of the image of the beast is required, these men refuse, of course, and so the remaining are quickly killed and become models for obedient martyrdom as well. Now that all have been martyred, they stand next to Jesus on Mount Zion, awaiting the end of tribulation. So if the 144,000 were sealed in chapter 7, how could they be killed at mid-tribulation? Wouldn't the sealing protect them? Well, if you go back to where it talks about that sealing, they were sealed, and the text indicated that the sealing would prevent the supernatural disaster to harm them. Much like God protected Israel and Goshen during the time of the Exodus plagues, these men would be protected too. But back in chapter 6, we're told these disasters won't harm the oil or wine either, which is a reference to the land of Israel. So the disasters spare the land of Israel. They also spared these men no matter where they traveled. So they were sealed to be protected from God's judgments, but evidently that sealing is removed at mid-tribulation. The time for evangelism to end and for all destinies has to be set. God purposed to allow believers to experience martyrdom, and the first fruits of that martyrdom will be these people. By their example, the saints will have encouragement to know that death is not something to fear. Back in chapter 12, we were told that mid-tribulation would include believers dying rather than bending their knee to Satan. The martyring of the 144,000 is further evidence that the opportunity to know the truth and be saved by God's grace has come to an end on earth. It's highly symbolic to see these God selected and commissioned to reignite the spread of the gospel having died and completed that mission. The suggestion is that the time for sharing the faith and persuading people to believe is over. With the Antichrist demanding everyone take a stand, everyone has to decide. So the undecided column quickly drops to 0. So then we got to ask, well, who's left to save? The saved already believe, and the unsaved have taken the mark and are therefore unsavable, except for one group. We come back to that remaining holdout group later, but for now, let's move ahead. Meanwhile, the Lord offers one very final opportunity to the world to believe, and the offer comes from the very top. Verse 6, and I saw another angel flying him in heaven, having an eternal gospel to preach to those who live on earth, and to every nation and tribe and tongue and people. And he said with a loud voice, Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment is come. Worship him who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and the springs of the water. Now John sees another flying angel in mid-heaven, the atmosphere, and the last time we saw an angel flying was to announce the coming woe judgments. And sure enough, this angel is bringing another heavenly declaration to the entire world. This angel preaches an eternal gospel to the world. He calls it an eternal gospel because it's the very same message that's always been preached. There's only ever been one way to be saved, one plan for salvation, one message that must be believed. The details of that message have expanded over time to include more specifics, but the thrust of that message never changed. From Adam and woman in the garden to Noah to Abraham to Moses, Samuel, David, the apostles, the message has always been that a righteous man lives by faith in the promises of God. And here the angel delivers it one last time to the world of this age. In this case, the angel declares that the window was closing, the salvation train is getting ready to leave the station. Hour of judgment has come, and in this context, hour simply means a short time. So don't fear the Antichrist, don't fear physical death, but instead fear the Lord and trust him who has made all things. This angelic declaration is God's final presentation of the gospel to the world prior to the return of Christ. We can hardly accuse God of not making enough opportunities available. Not only has God delivered the gospel by means of men who face death for their willingness to declare truth, but now God has also elevated that presentation to the heavenly realm. In this moment, the gospel is proclaimed to the entire world, just as Jesus promised it would back in Matthew chapter 24. Jesus tells us that the gospel will be preached in the whole world before the end of the tribulation, and here we see that fulfilled. He says it will be done as a testimony to all nations. It's a testimony both in the sense that some might believe, though we don't know how many, but also in the sense that it's a warning to convict the world. And it's also a reminder to us that salvation has never and will never depend on human beings. Granted, often the method he will use is people like me and you, people who worry about those who have been unreached. So when those people come to your mind, perhaps that's a sign that you're supposed to be a part of the solution. All right, back to the text of verse 8. And another angel, a second one, followed, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who has made all the nations drink of the wine of the passion of her immorality. Then another angel, a third one, followed them, saying with a loud voice, If anyone worships the beast in his image, and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he also will drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength in the cup of his anger, and he will be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. They have no rest day and night, those who worship the beast in his image, and whoever receives the mark of his name. So the Lord has more to say to the earth, so a second angel makes an announcement, and this second announcement concerns the enemy and his kingdom on earth. The name of the Antichrist kingdom is Babylon, and this is the first mention of this city name. As we've seen already, major topics of Revelation are generally spread out over multiple chapters in the book. The topic of Babylon is significant to understanding the events of the second half of tribulation. But since it's revealed in pieces, beginning here and running until the end of chapter 18, then we'll cover that later when we explore it. Next, a third angel declares that if anyone doesn't heed the call to believe the gospel and takes the mark, they will be tormented forever. There will be no second chance for anyone with the mark of the beast because there is no source of truth after this moment. Since God himself has preached by means of an angel, human messengers are no longer available. No more evangelism, no new voices sharing the truth, so the fate of every person on earth will be sealed at this midpoint. Moreover, the punishment is eternal and terrible. Verse 10, we have one of the most detailed descriptions of eternal punishment in the Bible. The specific judgment described is one of burning and suffering and torment. Those who die absent faith suffer the wrath of God for sin. Specifically, they will suffer in intense heat, described as fire and brimstone, and they suffer night and day without end and without rest. They're suffering without end because they are forever existing in a sinful state. So their suffering is a result of who they are, not merely for what they've done. Finally, they will suffer in the presence of the angels and the Lamb of God. Now, in recent time, it's become fashionable to proclaim that there is no hell and that a loving God would not punish people so harshly. Some claim God gives second chances after death, and others claim that eternal punishment doesn't last forever, but after some time it ends. Well, we might be able to emphasize with someone's desire to see unbelievers given a reprieve in eternity, or entertain thoughts that eternal punishment must end at some point. We can't let our emotions override the meaning of the text. Scripture is abundantly clear about the nature and duration of eternal judgment for unbelievers. Unbelievers face a never-ending burning torment, the wrath of an angry God who hates sin, and they face eternal judgment because their sinful nature itself never ceases even in eternity. Now, ironically, those false teachers who try to convince others that there is no hell or punishment isn't eternal, contribute to the plight of the sinner. They remove perhaps the one incentive God was prepared to use in converting the unbeliever, thus ensuring their demise. And these false teachers also give purpose to hell's very existence. Verse 12. Here is the perseverance of the saints, who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, Write, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, so that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow with them. Verse 12, John says, here is the perseverance of the saints, and notice that this verse is not a quote. An angel was speaking in verse 11, and a voice from heaven starts talking in verse 13. So this is commentary by John. The perseverance of the saints means the way the saints maintain hope in these difficult days. So John says to the saints of tribulation, here's how you maintain hope during difficult 3.5 years that are about to start. They maintain hope by understanding that dying is a blessing. Those who die in the Lord will have been released from living in a horrific, sinful world. They will have rested from the burden of trying to escape the enemy, surviving on meager supplies of food and water, of dealing with sinful, sick, weak bodies, and the uncertainty of what lies around the corner. The hope of all believers in that day will be the rest that death brings, knowing their deeds will follow them. The mention of deeds following is a reference to the eternal rewards that will be theirs for persevering in difficult times. They will be rewarded for maintaining a strong witness in the midst of so much pressure to recant. And they can press on knowing that if and when death comes, it is a blessing. But more than just escaping the turmoil of tribulation, death brings another blessing for them. If a person dies in this time, they will be assured of living in the kingdom in a resurrected state. And in that resurrected state, they will be sinless and glorified. And as a glorified member of the kingdom, they will be a part of the government. Believers who live to the end of tribulation and never die will also enter the kingdom, but they will enter in natural bodies. Therefore, they won't be a part of the kingdom government. We'll come back to that topic in a later episode. So those who die in the Lord from now will be blessed, and that number will be very high. In fact, martyrdom will be the norm. So let's look at verse 14. Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and sitting on the cloud was one like a son of man, having a golden crown on his head, and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe. Then he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. So on a white cloud is one like a son of man, who has a sickle in his hand. At the command of an angel, he swung his sickle, and he reaps the earth. Now, obviously, we have
bunch of questions about what John is seeing. So let's work back through the details. Begin by determining who is the one on the cloud with the sickle. John says he was sitting on a cloud like a son of man, and the reference to Son of Man immediately draws us to suspect this is Christ. We know it is a messianic term in the New Testament, and John commonly uses that term for Christ in his gospel. But there are several details to undermine that conclusion. First, the man has a golden crown on his head, but the Greek word for crown is Stephanos. That is not the Greek word used for a crown worn by a king, which is diadem. In fact, the next time we see Jesus described in chapter 19, we're told this, chapter 19, verse 12, his eyes are flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems, and he has a name written on him which no one knows except for himself. Now, so the form of crown Christ wears is a diadem, not a Stephanos. Second, the one on the cloud takes an order from an angel sent from heaven. It seems unlikely that the Lord in his glorified form would take a command from an angel. Third, the angel that gives the command is described by John as another angel. Another could simply mean another angel like those in the chapter, but it suggests that both of these characters are angels. Giving further support to that conclusion, Jesus described in the Olivet Discourse a reaping of the earth during tribulation by angels. Jesus said in Matthew 24:31, and he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. So in speaking about the events in the second half, Jesus said the elect will be gathered or reaped from the earth. There is a regathering of the elect at Jesus' second coming, which we'll go over later, but throughout the Great Tribulation, the angels will be reaping believers through martyrdom. So the two in view here are both angels, and the directive from heaven comes announcing that believers are now to be removed. This is our confirmation that the second half of tribulation is a time of great martyrdom. Angels are reapers of believers. And according to Jesus in Luke 16, believers are escorted into heaven by angels. But while angels will be reaping the earth of believers, the actual process of death will be carried out by the Antichrist forces. Remember, Daniel told us that this would happen. The Lord allows the Antichrist to prosper and have success in killing the saints for 3.5 years. This is that time of martyrdom. But as the angels already declared, his success will be temporary. Verse 17, and another angel came out of the temple, which is in heaven, and he also had a sharp sickle. Then another angel, the one who has power of fire, came out from the altar, and he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, Put in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe. So the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trotted outside the city, and blood came out from the winepress up to the horses' bridles for a distance of 200 miles. Finally, two more angels emerge from the temple in heaven, and one angel has a sickle also. This again confirms our earlier conclusions that these characters are angels and none of them are Jesus. Like before, the second angel gives an order to the first to reap, but this time the reaping task involves removing a different group from the earth. We know this second group is different than the first because they face a different fate. This is a description of the deaths of the world's entire population of unbelievers at a point near the end of tribulation. Obviously, this chapter has been describing events that span the second half, and believers are dying throughout this time, and the death of the unbelievers is largely confined to the final days and weeks of tribulation. This group will be placed into the great winepress of the wrath of God to the effect of great bloodshed, John says. This is looking ahead to the end of the 7 years, even as we exit this mid-tribulation period. Specifically, it's referencing the War of Armageddon, which we will begin to study on our next episode. But for now, the reader gets a taste of what's coming for the unbeliever to balance what we've learned about the fate of the believers. and unbelievers will become a bloodbath, literally, producing a river of blood rising incredibly high and traveling impossibly far. The blood is 4.5 feet high and 200 miles long. Well, how is this possible? Because it happens in a narrow ravine that runs in Israel. As we'll study later, the battle begins in the valley of Kidron, which is probably the channel through which this blood is going to flow. Nevertheless, the amount of blood here is literally the blood of billions of people. If we assume it flowed to the width of the valley, we're talking about 62 billion cubic feet of blood. That will require over 300 billion people's blood, which is clearly too high to be realistic. Instead, it likely means that at the moment of the winepress, when the armies are killed, that there will be a sudden release of blood in the valley, and it will produce a 4.5 foot wave of blood that flows away from the valley for 200 miles. We're still talking about a tsunami of blood, and as you let that scene settle in your mind, let it balance your concern for the believer. Vengeance is mine, declares the Lord. So the ending of Revelation 14 describes the eventual fate of the unbelieving world upon the return of Christ. But the specific moment when the winepress of the wrath of God takes place will occur at the end of tribulation. In fact, this reference is a foreshadowing of the bowl judgments, which are right around the corner in a chapter or so. And when it comes, the world will see immense bloodshed. But in the meantime, the second half of tribulation is a relatively peaceful time for the unbeliever. Only at the very end will the unbeliever encounter suffering and death. The bowl judgments bring a whole new level of suffering, unlike anything the world has ever witnessed before. But the people who suffer through most of the second half of tribulation will be believers and Jews who oppose the Antichrist. So chapters 10 through 14 have taken us out of the trumpet judgments and into these amazing events at mid-tribulation. Those events have drawn to a close, and now we wonder how the second 3.5 years will proceed. Though there's still much to happen until we get to the end of tribulation, in a way, the answer will be a bit of disappointment, because the next 2 chapters pick up at a point near the end of tribulation. Most of the second half of tribulation will have concluded, and in reality, we've already studied most of the last half anyway. In chapters 12 through 14, we learn that during the last 3.5 years, the enemy's confined to earth. Together with the Antichrist and false prophet, he persecutes and kills anyone who threatens his existence, particularly Christians and Jews. The Antichrist and false prophet pursue an economic and police state that brings a temporary sense of peace to the unbeliever, but it brings great persecution to believers and Jews. That's how the final 3.5 years of tribulation will go, until the bowl judgments begin. So to end this episode, let's revisit all 3 judgment series in tribulation. The first series of judgments, the seal judgments, contain all 3 judgments, so that the 7th seal are the 7 trumpet judgments, and then the 7th trumpet judgment will become the 7 bowl judgments. When the judgments were suspended at the end of chapter 9, we knew we were waiting for the 7th trumpet to sound. We don't know the exact timing for any of these judgments, whether it's seals or trumpets or bowls. We only know relative positioning within the 7 years of tribulation. For example, we know that the seal judgments cannot begin until tribulation itself has started by the signing of a covenant. We also know that the seal judgments must happen before the trumpet, and the trumpets have to happen before the bowls. And we know that the seal and trumpet judgments happen before the middle of tribulation. This is based on the sequence of the chapters in Revelation. Now, as we transition into the second half of tribulation, we know that the bowl judgments are after the middle part. But we're faced with the same question of where exactly in the second half do these judgments take place? The short answer is we can't be sure exactly, but there are some strong suggestions that they come at the very end of tribulation. And we'll come back to this question when we return to the final judgments of tribulation. And that's next time on Just One Man.